Hi, I'm Dan Handelman with Flying Focus Video Collective. I'm also with a group called Portland Copwatch. And today I want to show you some video from a hearing that was held around a man named Matt Klug, who was tasered by Portland police in September 2014. And he appealed his case to what most people think of as a police review board. It's known as the Citizen Review Committee. He actually ended up going to about 5 meetings of that group, and then because they couldn't agree with the police bureau, there was a hearing in front of city council, which hadn't happened since 2003, and it's now 2017, so it's a very long time between hearings in front of city council. And they had to decide whether or not they thought the police officer who used the taser 6 times against Mr. Klug was in policy or not. I want to start by showing the video that a bystander took of Mr. Klug that day in 2014. So now I'm going to show you some clips from the city council hearing that was held on February 22, and I'm going to show them a little bit out of order just to help tell the story a little bit better. First, you're going to hear from the CRC chair, Kristin Malone.
On September 17, 2014, several PPB members dispatched to a Northwest Portland intersection following a report that a cyclist, the appellant, had struck the window of a motorist while stopped at a traffic light. Sergeant A contacted the appellant first, followed by officers B and D. After the appellant began shouting and emptying his pockets on the ground, the officers took steps to restrain him. The 3 officers worked together to push the appellant up to a wall and tried to handcuff him, while the appellant struggled against the officers. During this time, Officer B issued a taser warning and discharged his taser 3 times in rapid succession in the appellant's back. After these initial discharges, the appellant fell to the ground. Sergeant A and Officer D were on top of the appellant's upper body, and Officer B worked to stop the movement of the appellant's legs, which at one point knocked Officer B to the ground. While the appellant was on the ground, Officer B placed the taser directly onto the appellant's calf and released a 4th charge of electricity. As the Bureau members continued to work to handcuff the appellant, Officer B fired the taser's probes into the appellant's back, issuing a 5th activation of the taser. Sometime later, Officer B again discharged the taser, this time apparently by accident. The probes were still attached to the appellant, and the taser log registered an activation of up to 1 second. The Bureau investigated several alleged policy violations relating to this encounter, but the only one remaining for consideration today is Allegation 2, which charges that Officer B used inappropriate force in taking appellant into custody. The Bureau found that Officer B's uses of the taser in this incident were lawful and within policy. However, it recommended a debriefing to counsel Officer B on the design differences found in the new X2 taser model he was using, which the Bureau believes led to the last accidental activation. The CRC reviewed the record and held a public hearing to determine whether the Bureau's finding was supported by the evidence. In other words, we, like you, evaluated whether a reasonable person reviewing the evidence in the case file could have concluded that Officer B's uses of force were lawful and within policy. The particular policy we evaluated was a December 2013 executive order regarding Directive 1051.00, which provides rules for the use of electronic control weapons, or tasers. At an appeal hearing, the CRC concluded that the evidence did not support the Bureau's finding and voted to challenge. The CRC recommended a finding of sustained and continued to do so after a conference with Chief Marshman. All of the CRC members who voted and did not abstain agreed that Officer B's conduct was not in line with the directive. There were 3 main areas of disagreement with the Bureau. First, CRC members felt that the first 3 uses of the taser were not supported by the directive because appellant's conduct did not meet the definition of active aggression. Although Officer B and only Officer B reported a feeling that the appellant might punch Sergeant A, CRC members found that the evidence showed that the appellant was merely resisting the officer's attempts to restrain him. 3 officers had the appellant pinned against a wall and had hold of his arms and torso. Therefore, a reasonable person would have determined that there was no, quote, threat or overt act of assault coupled with the present ability to carry out the threat or assault, unquote. Further, some members found that the directive did not permit the fourth and fifth Taser deployments, which occurred after the appellant had been brought to the ground and had 3 Bureau members on top of him. Section 3.2 of the directive states that, quote, members will not use an ECW on a handcuffed or otherwise restrained subject, for example, a subject being held to the ground by multiple officers, unless the subject is actively engaged in behavior that creates a substantial risk of injury to the subject, members, or others, and no other reasonable force options exist. The video in the record showed that the drive stun to appellant's calf occurred while the appellant was on his right side. Officer B had gotten hold of the appellant's left leg and was kneeling on his right leg, while Officer D pressed on appellant's torso and Sergeant A straddled across his shoulders and held his left arm. Seconds later, when Officer B deployed the probes, appellant had been placed prone on his stomach and appeared well controlled, with Officer B straddling both legs with a knee on appellant's buttocks, while Sergeant A was seated straddling the appellant's lower back. Sergeant A was holding the appellant's left arm and Officer D was holding his right arm. CRC members felt that Section 3.2 specifically prohibited the use of the Taser in these circumstances because appellant was well restrained. The circumstances in this case directly track the example in the directive of a subject being held to the ground by multiple officers. CRC members disagreed with the Bureau's conclusion that the Taser activations were justified because the appellant was kicking his legs immediately after being taken to the ground and trying to roll over. Some felt that these acts did not rise to the level of active aggression. In any event, the video showed that the appellant was manually restrained and no longer kicking at the time of the activation on his calf, and that he was prone and largely immobile when Officer B deployed the probes. Therefore, with respect to the fourth and fifth cycles of the Taser, CRC members found that the evidence did not support a finding that the appellant posed a substantial risk of injury to himself or others, or that the Bureau members lacked other reasonable force options. Finally, the CRC took issue with the final Taser deployment, which occurred after the officers believed the appellant to be effectively restrained. This activation was recorded in the Taser log, but was not reported by Officer B because he was unaware that it took place. The Bureau believes that this accidental activation occurred because the Taser's activation button is placed along the side of the weapon in a similar location to where officers are trained to rest or index their fingers on their firearms. The Bureau has noted that the Taser Officer B was using was not the Bureau's standard issued Taser, but instead a new model called the X2, which the Bureau was trying out at the time, and which has now been formally adopted. The Bureau has suggested that the officer's instinct to index his finger instead caused him to tap the activation button, sending another charge of electricity down the attached wires. The CRC found this information useful in understanding how this accident occurred. However, Directive 1051.00 is agnostic as to the particular device being used. It applies to electronic control weapons generally, including the one being used on duty by Officer B. The CRC is not aware of any rule that would suspend the general force guidelines when new weapons are being tested in the field and used on civilians, and rightfully so. Community members have a right to expect that officers are properly trained on any weapons used outside of the training facility, and that in all cases, weapons use will be governed by the Bureau's force and ECW directives. The Bureau has also contended that Officer B should be exonerated with respect to the sixth activation because it lasted only a short time or because it may not have had an effect on the appellant. On the second point, the Bureau characterizes the appellant as not remembering that discharge. But in his IA interview conducted nearly 8 months after the incident, the appellant reported feeling more than 3 charges of electricity during the incident, and he was not asked any follow-up questions on the precise timing of those shocks. In any event, there's no language in the directive allowing otherwise impermissible uses of force based on the duration or amount of pain felt by the citizen. Therefore, CRC members found that the sixth discharge was not justified by the directive and that evidence did not exist to support this use of force.
So now we're going to double back to the beginning of the hearing where Mayor Ted Wheeler kind of laid out the ground rules of what was going on and explained some technicalities about the hearing. And then the director of the Independent Police Review Division, which oversees the Citizen Review Committee and helps intake the complaints and does a little bit of the investigation, but turns over the interviews of police most of the time to the police for investigation, will give a little bit of her perspective of the case history.
This is not a public hearing, public testimony. Rather, counsel is reviewing a decision of the Portland Police Bureau, which the CRC has appealed to the council. The council must decide if the PPB decision is or is not supported by the evidence in the record. Since Portland City Code provides that no new evidence may be introduced at the hearing, and because this matter involves counsel's review of a community member complaint that potentially could result in discipline, public comment or testimony regarding this matter will not be solicited or received.
The CRC held a case file review of the case on October 7th, 2015. At the conclusion of the case file review, the investigation was sent back to Internal Affairs for additional investigation. After additional investigation was obtained, the first appeal hearing was scheduled for April 20th, 2016, but was subsequently canceled because Bureau members were ordered not to appear per order from former Acting Chief Henderson. On May 4th, 2016, the CRC conducted the second appeal hearing in which they voted 8-0 to challenge the first allegation findings from exonerated to exonerated with debriefing. The CRC voted 7-1 to affirm the second allegation finding of exonerated with debriefing. On May 6th, IPR received notification from Internal Affairs that allegation number 2 would be sent back to Internal Affairs for new findings due to the incorrect version of the Police Bureau directive being used in the findings process. The Bureau accepted the CRC recommendation regarding allegation number 1. On September 7, 2016, the CRC conducted a third appeal hearing for allegation number 2, this time with the correct directive, and they voted 6 in favor, with 2 members abstaining, to challenge allegation number 2 from exonerated with debriefing to sustained. On December 7, 2016, the CRC held a conference hearing with Portland Police Bureau Chief Michael Marshman, and the CRC voted 4 in favor, 1 abstained to continue with their original challenge motion of sustained on allegation number 2. That all leads us to today, as no agreement could be reached between the CRC and the Police Bureau during the conference hearing.
I think that this case is a really good example from the CRC's perspective of how much of that timing is out of the CRC's control. I think if you will look at the reasons this came back and back again, the Bureau, in our opinion, and I think rightly so, didn't complete an investigation. We had additional questions about the Taser log, as well as witnesses that weren't interviewed, that the Bureau did then go back and re-interview. We convened for an appeal, and it was the Bureau who didn't show. The volunteers were present and ready to hear the appeal, but the Bureau members were under instructions not to attend. And then we went through a whole appeal hearing under the wrong directive, which was selected and evaluated by the Bureau. And although there was some complaint about that during that appeal hearing, the kind of verdict we received from the city attorney and the Bureau was that it was the right directive, only several days later to discover that the appellant was correct and that the case had originally been evaluated under the wrong directive. And then additional time is taken when we disagree with the Bureau, because there's a kind of procedure for us to meet again with Chief Marshman and see if through dialogue we can agree on a disposition that would prevent us from coming here.
And you did, in fact, on one of the 2 issues, get to a disposition.
We did. But on this final complaint, it proceeded to you, and that kind of conference process of having another meeting to talk with the chief about it after we've already made our decision elongates the time as well.
So now you get to hear from Mr. Klug himself, who was given the least time of anybody to testify at the hearing. Sitting next to him is what's called his appeals process advisor, who, as the name suggests, only can advise him about how the process works and can't really advocate for him, which is too bad because Mr. Klug and other people like him often come to these appeals and can't stay focused on the incident at hand. Although he did a fairly good job, he didn't stay focused the complete time, but we'll show you some of the excerpts.
My name is Matthew Klug, and I'm a resident of Portland. I'm an epileptic. I'm the survivor of traumatic brain injury from a long time ago, and I'm a coma survivor, and I suffer mental illness. I'm not a lawyer, but I'll explain what happened to me to the best of my ability. These things kept coming to decision points, and decisions were made that kept making this compoundedly worse over and over and over again. This has been 890 days, and I'm still shaking about it now. The sergeant who pulled me over, Sergeant A, pulled me over. I pulled over a block after I heard a boop, boop, So, I turned left at a light. I had the green left arrow, and it must have been red for him because I heard the thing. I looked back, there were lights. A block later, I pulled over, just out for a bike ride. It's a little heavy-handed. He came out of the car, reaching, unbuckled his holster, and slid back the cover. Now, that should scare at anyone. And it did me. I put my hands up in the air and I said, and the witnesses in the paperwork heard me say verbally, "What did I do? What did I do?" I didn't know what his animus towards me was, so I said, I didn't, maybe I'm close to the bus station, so I said, "I'm not homeless." I don't know why I said that. I thought that perhaps he'd lighten up. And the officers came right after that in the old gold unmarked car. I believe those are the enhanced crisis intervention team members. They did not de-escalate. The first thing they said to me was, "Turn around, turn around." I turned around, and the sergeant did not try to cuff me. They all came at me at the same time.
So now you're going to hear from the Chief of Police, Chief Marshman, who disagreed with the CRC's proposed sustained finding and is banking his argument on the definition of what active aggression is and saying that being hit by a taser really isn't such a big deal.
As stated earlier, the taser policy in question today is Directive 1051. Active aggression, I believe, is what we're talking about today, and that is a threat or overt act of an assault through physical or verbal means, coupled with the present ability to carry out the threat or assault, which reasonably indicates that an assault or injury to any person is imminent. When reasonable, under the circumstances, members are authorized to use the ECW or taser in the following: in response to active aggression, and second, in drive-stun mode, in the event that the probes are insufficient spread or dislodged, in close quarters, like you'll see in the video, to protect a member, create safe distance, or avoid the use of a higher level of force. And to avoid the higher use of force, I think, is appropriate in this instance. Members will not use a taser on a handcuffed or otherwise restrained subject, and in our policy, we give the example of a subject being held to the ground by multiple officers, unless the subject is, again, actively engaged in behavior that creates a substantial risk of injury to the subject themselves, member or others, and no other reasonable force is available. So the reasonableness standard, as was said earlier, the CRC may find the outcome of an administrative investigation like this unreasonable if the committee finds that the findings are not supported by the evidence. I think it's important to note here that the RU manager who wrote the finding, their standard is the preponderance of the evidence, or like a greater weight of the evidence. The taser, you see that little flash, that's like the taser going off. In the drive-stun mode, if it's raised up higher, it registers a cycle. The computer chip in the taser registers that, but doesn't register that it's making contact or if it's effective. So in a drive-stun mode, my assertion is if it's up in the air, and you'll see in the successive videos, it's going, but it's not contacting. And then again, not to get too technical, but that new taser, the Bureau has since adopted it. The Officer B, was testing that, which we do with a lot of tools we deploy in the street. When you index your finger, which we train to, there's a button right there, which is how you activate that in drive-stun mode. One of my assertions is when you're struggling, like in that video, when he's getting kicked and rolled over, he's by default clenching because you're getting knocked over. I think he's hitting that button, and that's when you can see the flashes going off. Officer B's statement, it's what he observed. Sergeant A was being yelled at. Complainant's hands were moving rapidly. Officer B believed that the complainant was about to engage Sergeant A in physical altercation. That's what led Officer B to move in and start taking some action. The next statement, as I approached, this is all quotes from Officer B. He notated that complainant was intensely focused on Sergeant A, continually yelling at him, thrusting his hands in his pockets, lowering his head. And from Officer B's training experience, he believes this behavior indicates a person is initiating the physical altercation with Sergeant A. So Officer B goes on with his statements. He believes Sergeant A was struggling with complainant. Complainant was arching him back and pushed against Sergeant A. He thought he was going to try to punch him. So that's when he gives the taser warning. Officer B believes the complainant was violent and it continued to escalate. Officer B says the taser was initially effective in deterring the aggressive behavior. Complainant drops his knees and begins kicking his feet. And seeing the officer get kicked over, to me, is active aggression. The video shows Officer B gets up after being kicked, employs the taser in drive stun mode again for the 3 seconds. Complainant still kicking and struggling. Basically, we're just trying to get the complainant into custody. CRC concern number 1. Officer B's use of taser was unreasonable because his use was not in response to active aggression. I essentially, my assertion is during a video, I believe complainant is in active aggression with punching or attempting to punch Sergeant A, kicking the officer and having the officer fall to the ground. For CRC concern number 2, being restrained since he was held down to the ground by officers during a taser application. Yes, we were holding him down, but he wasn't restrained. He continued to fight and kick. The sergeant was struggling to get his right arm. In one of the videos, you could almost see him start to do a push-up with the officers on him. And again, Officer C wasn't able to get control of his right arm. And CRC concern number 3, they didn't believe the last discharge of the taser was supported by the evidence. After the complainant was handcuffed, he was still struggling. And you have to take control, maintain control of that taser. He's still struggling even though he's handcuffed. Again, my assertion is, though nobody recalls it, I believe that taser application, it's due to the trying to control that taser.
The police bureau finding was, quote, exonerated with a debriefing, unquote. Portland City Code section 3.21.020S defines supported by the evidence as, quote, a finding regarding a complaint is supported by the evidence when a reasonable person could make the finding in light of the evidence, whether or not the reviewing body agrees with the finding, unquote. 9, if counsel determines that the police bureau finding of exonerated with debriefing is supported by the evidence, the complaint will be closed. 10, if counsel determines that the police bureau finding of exonerated with a debriefing is not supported by the evidence, counsel will need to decide on the appropriate finding in this case.
The CRC is a volunteer body comprised of 11 community members. We have several responsibilities, including hearing appeals concerning allegations that members of the Portland Police Bureau have violated city policy. As we review the conclusions reached by the Bureau's initial decision makers, we have the authority to challenge findings that are not supported by the evidence. When that happens, we have an opportunity to resolve these differences through dialogue with the Bureau. In the rare case that the CRC and the Bureau are unable to agree on the proper finding on an allegation, City Codes provides that you all have the final say. This is so rare that I believe this is only the second such hearing in the past decade.
My understanding from a prior conversation I had with Mr. Handelman is this is the first time council has had an appeal like this since 2003.
Yes.
So no one, with the exception perhaps of Commissioner Saltzman, has been through this before. So the rest of us are learning on the fly. From the moment the officers had contact with the, should we call him the complainant at this point? The complainant. How long did it take to get the complainant into custody?
I don't have that specific time frame, but I believe that video that you saw, it's obviously towards the beginning. He wasn't handcuffed at the end of that. I assume he's handcuffed fairly quickly after that. So
this entire
15,
encounter
20
lasted
seconds.
how long?
I'm guessing. I can pull up the video, maybe 15, 20 seconds. It's fairly brief.
Okay. Is it relevant to your analysis that there were 3 officers involved?
Yes, sir. Very relevant.
And at what point would the number of officers involved begin to change your the way in which you view restraint or whether other kind of force was warranted? I guess the point I'm trying to get at is the difference between having a single officer trying to subdue someone and a large number of officers, and how does that change the analysis?
If it's just one officer and one subject, I think the probability for either party to get injured is greater. with two officers and one subject rather, it's going to diminish. We actually train, if possible, with three, because I believe with three officers and one subject, again, the probability for any of those involved to get injured lessens. With one, like in this encounter, you could have one officer trying to control one arm, another officer another arm, and a third officer trying to control the legs. That's actually how we train.
Chief, one of the terms that you've called out in the directive that's before us is the meaning of the phrase active aggression.
Yes.
And I guess just in terms of interpreting that and applying that concept to the facts in this case, how much of that is an objective standard and how much is a subjective standard? And what guidance do you have for us in terms of the interpretation?
Well, in this specific case, Officer B, when he's down by the legs of the complainant and the complainant's kicking hard enough to knock the officer over, to me, I think that's a clear example of active aggression. He's struggling. He's fighting. Later on in the video, when he's trying to do a push-up, and you can see it better on his left arm, to me, that's active aggression of you're not allowing the officers to put you in handcuffs. You're obviously not complying, and you're trying to get up and get away.
So the chief is using a lot of subjective terms when he's trying to explain he thought that Mr. Klug, who in the video is clearly kind of thrashing around on the sidewalk because there's three big officers trying to pin him to the ground, is actively being aggressive as opposed to, I don't know, having a natural reaction to three people trying to pile on top of you. So we'll hear more about Commissioner Fish's line of questioning to the chief. We'll see what the council decides to vote and have a little bit more discussion about how the system works and other follow-up from this case on the next episode of the Flying Focus Video Bus. Thank you very much for watching. I'm again Dan Handelman with both Flying Focus Video and Portland Copwatch, and tune in next week for part 2.